October 1943, Bell Aircraft's factory in Niagara Falls, New York, was alive with noise and movement as the first P-63 Kingcobras came off the production line. But these fighters weren't painted in American insignia. They bore bright Soviet red stars right from the paint shop. The U.S. Army Air Forces had just completed testing the Kingcobra and gave their verdict. It was inferior to the P-51 Mustang, unfit for American pilots, and not worth sending to Europe or the Pacific. However, the Soviet Union urgently needed fighters. And under the Lend-Lease program, these rejected aircraft wouldn't go to waste. A total of 2,397 Kingcobras, about 72% of all built, were shipped to the USSR via the Alaska-Siberia route, flown first by American women pilots to Great Falls, Montana, then handed off to Soviet ferry pilots who would take them over the Bering Strait. When the first Kingcobras reached Soviet airfields in early 1944, veteran pilots took one look at the mid-engine design and its odd car-door cockpit and laughed. To them, it looked like another American discard, just like the earlier P-39 Airacobra, which the British had rejected and the Americans barely used. Soviet test pilot Andrei Kochkov was assigned to evaluate this supposed gift from the U.S. His first few flights nearly killed the entire program. To understand why the U.S. Army Air Forces dismissed the P-63 so firmly, you have to know what American fighter doctrine demanded in 1943. Vinau's U.S. strategic bombing campaign over Europe needed long-range escort fighters that could protect B-17 and B-24 bombers flying above 20,000 feet on deep raids into German airspace. At those heights, the P-51 Mustang dominated. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, with a two-stage supercharger, gave it unmatched performance exactly where the U.S. needed it most. The P-63, though a major improvement over the P-39 in almost every way, still couldn't rival the Mustang's high-altitude abilities. It ran on an Allison V1710-93 engine producing 1,325 horsepower, powerful at low altitudes, but its single-stage supercharger made it lose performance badly above 15,000 feet. For escort missions over Germany, that was a fatal weakness. Before we continue, let me know where you're watching from and what you already know about the P-63 Kingcobra. Comment below if this story is new to you. And if you enjoy detailed aviation history, consider subscribing to the channel. The Soviets were already the biggest users of the P-39 Airacobra, having received nearly half of the 9,500 built. Yet the Airacobra's reputation was mixed. Difficult handling, dangerous spin tendencies, and that strange mid-engine layout made many pilots uneasy. The P-63 inherited those same issues. With its engine mounted behind the pilot and a long drive shaft running under his feet to the propeller, the aircraft's balance was extremely sensitive and its spin recovery unpredictable. Now, Bell Aircraft wanted the Soviets to take thousands more of these rejected fighters. When Andrei Kochkov began testing the Kingcobra at the Soviet proving grounds, problems showed up immediately. During a standard spin test, the aircraft went into a flat spin, and the frame began to buckle under the pressure. The structure was failing under conditions any real combat pilot could face. Pilots might face in real combat. At first, Bell's engineers brushed off Kochkov's warnings. After all, he was just a Soviet test pilot flying an aircraft already declared fit for production by American standards. What could he possibly know that Bell's own experts didn't? But after Kochkov demonstrated the flat spin recovery problem several times, showing it was impossible to regain control without bailing out, Bell was forced to take him seriously. The Soviet Union was about to become the largest user of this fighter, and if their test pilots said it had deadly flaws, something had to change. So, modifications began. Soviet engineers suggested shifting the aircraft's center of gravity forward, adjusting the maximum aft CG limit to make spin recovery possible. They also increased pilot armor protection based on real combat experience and added extra hardpoints under the wings for bombs or external fuel tanks. Even with these improvements, Soviet pilots remained doubtful. The P-63 was still, at its core, an American fighter built for American doctrine. High-altitude operations to support strategic bombing. But on the Eastern Front, air combat rarely reached those heights, and that raised the question: what good was a high-altitude escort fighter in a low-altitude brawl? There was also a political issue. Under the 1943 Lend-Lease Agreement, the P-63s were officially reserved for fighting Japan in the Far East. The Soviets were supposed to keep them east of the Ural Mountains, quietly building strength for their eventual entry into the war against Japan. While thousands of Kingcobras were officially sitting in storage for that purpose, the war in Europe raged on. Soviet pilots were fighting the Luftwaffe daily, desperate for capable fighters. They couldn't afford to let hundreds of brand-new aircraft sit idle when every day cost lives. The Eastern Front was a completely different kind of air war. Unlike the high-altitude, long-range escort missions over Germany that American pilots flew, the Soviets fought at far lower levels. Most dogfights took place below 12,000 feet, usually between 6,000 and 10,000. Ground attack missions, the true focus of Soviet air operations, happened even lower, often skimming the treetops. These weren't long escort flights over enemy territory. They were short, brutal engagements flown from rough forward airfields near the front lines, often with multiple sorties a day. At these altitudes, something remarkable started to happen with the supposedly off-limits P-63s. Even though the official records claimed that only P-39s fought against Germany, reports began surfacing from both Soviet and German sources describing Kingcobras appearing over the Eastern Front. German Stuka pilot Hans Rude wrote in his memoirs about seeing American-built aircraft, Airacobras, Kingcobras, and Bostons over the Courland Pocket. By early 1945, German flak batteries were reporting shoot-downs of planes that didn't match the P-39's profile. Soviet veterans who served under the famous ace Alexander Pokrishkin later revealed that his entire 4th Guards Fighter Regiment secretly converted to P-63s in 1944. Then, something unexpected happened. The same aircraft America had written off as inferior turned out to be a perfect match for Soviet combat conditions. At the low altitudes where their battles actually took place, the Kingcobra's biggest weakness transformed into its greatest strength. The Allison engine, with its single-stage supercharger that struggled at high altitudes, suddenly became an asset at low ones. Couldn't perform well above 20,000 feet, but below 10,000, it became a beast. At low altitude, the P-63 could reach 408 mph, faster than nearly any Luftwaffe aircraft operating in that range. The heavy armor that American pilots once criticized for weighing the plane down became a lifesaver in ground attack missions. The Kingcobra's cockpit was surrounded by an armored bathtub that could absorb hits from anti-aircraft fire that would have destroyed lighter planes. Soviet pilots who had flown fragile aircraft like the old Polikarpov I-16 were stunned at how much damage the P-63 could take and still keep flying. Its 37mm M4 cannon, which American pilots found awkward to aim in high-altitude dogfights, became devastatingly effective at low altitude. One direct hit could destroy a German tank, armored vehicle, or even another aircraft. The P-63's roll rate, 110 degrees per second, was outstanding, better than the P-47, P-40, P-51, and even Japan's Kawanishi N-1K2. In the tight, twisting low-level dogfights of the Eastern Front, that roll rate often meant the difference between life and death. Soviet pilots quickly learned they could dive the Kingcobra faster than any German aircraft could follow. Its structural speed limit was around 562 mph, an astonishing figure for 1944. If a German fighter got behind you, you could simply nose down and vanish. knowing your pursuer risked tearing his wings off if he tried to keep up. The heated, sealed cockpit was another welcome surprise. Pilots who had spent winters freezing in open Soviet planes suddenly found themselves in relative comfort. The excellent American radios allowed clear communication, something Soviet-built fighters often lacked. And the tricycle landing gear made takeoffs and landings from rough frontline airstrips much safer than tail-dragger. Designs, unofficial combat reports began to tell a consistent story. Soviet pilots were winning battles in aircraft the Americans had dismissed as unfit for combat. They developed unique group tactics that maximized the P-63's advantages. Low-level intercepts of German bombers and attackers, quick strikes on armored columns, and escort missions for the Il-2 Zahntrieb, Seefuhrtorped and Sturmovik. The Kingcobra's low altitude, speed let it keep pace with attack aircraft, and still have energy to fight defenders, pilots who had struggled. With the unpredictable handling of Soviet, fighters found the P-63 surprisingly forgiving. It still demanded respect in spins, and its wing fuel tanks could ignite if hit. But overall, it was stable, predictable, and resilient. Ideal for pilots flying multiple sorties each day from crewed airfields. The 37mm cannon, while not perfect, proved devastating against the targets they actually faced: German bombers, ground attack planes, and reconnaissance aircraft. One well-aimed shot could sever a tail or blow off a wing. Against the waves of Stukas and Heinkels still flying over the Eastern Front, the Kingcobra was a scythe. Gradually, Soviet aces began switching to the P-63. Many of the USSR's top pilots, including Alexander Pokrishkin, already a legend in the P-39, considered the Kingcobra an even better machine. Faster, tougher, and more survivable. By 1945, credible reports confirmed P-63s in action over Königsberg, Poland, and even during the assault on Berlin. German after-action reports recorded Kingcobras being shot down by both fighters and flak, proof that America's rejected fighter had found its war and was thriving in it. Eastern Front usage became overwhelming, even as official Soviet records continued the fiction that only P-39s had fought the Germans. When the Soviet Union finally declared war on Japan on August 9, 1945, same day, the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. P-63s that had been reserved for the Far East campaign finally entered official combat. Operation August Storm, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, unleashed massive air operations over Japanese-held territory in Manchuria, Korea, and the Kuril Islands. The 17th Fighter Aviation Regiment of the 191st Fighter Division flew P-63s in escort, close air support, and ground attack missions. On August 15, 1945, the day Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Lieutenant Miro Nichenko scored the Kingcobra's first officially recognized aerial victory, shooting down a Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa off the coast of North Korea. Japanese air resistance was almost non-existent by then. Japan had few fighters left to challenge Soviet air power. Yet the P-63s proved deadly effective in their intended role: low-altitude ground attacks. Their heavy armor and 37mm cannon made them ideal for destroying entrenched positions and soft targets. The 888th and 410th Fighter Regiments also flew Kingcobras during the amphibious landings on the Kuril Islands, providing cover for an invasion fleet made up of old torpedo boats and converted freighters that desperately needed air protection. Soviet Navy P-63s patrolled over the Pacific, though combat was brief. The war ended too soon for these units to see their full potential against Japan. But by then, it hardly mattered. The Kingcobra had already proven its worth on the Eastern Front, excelling in the low-altitude conditions that defined Soviet warfare. When the war ended, the truth about the P-63's combat record began to surface. As of May 9, 1945, Soviet frontline units still possessed 1,448 Kingcobras, a massive force that continued flying long after the U.S. had retired its last P-63s in 1946. The Soviets kept them in active service until around 1950, when they were gradually reassigned to training roles. And in that new purpose, the Kingcobra revealed another surprising advantage. It became the ideal jet transition trainer. The P-63's tricycle landing gear configuration matched that of the new MiG-15 jets entering service, unlike earlier Soviet piston fighters that used tailwheel layouts. Student pilots could safely practice takeoffs and landings on the forgiving Kingcobra before moving on to the far more temperamental MiG-15. This training role extended the aircraft's service life into the early 1950s, with some Soviet units secretly keeping one or two Kingcobras off the books as practice aircraft, even after switching entirely to jets. The similarities in handling were so close that P-63 experience was considered valuable preparation for jet operations. NATO intelligence later assigned the type the reporting name Fred, recognizing that enough of them remained in use to justify monitoring. France also received 114 P-63s after the war and used them during the First Indochina War. They flew in ground attack roles until 1951, when maintenance issues and parts shortages led to their replacement by Grumman F-8F Bearcats. The story of the P-63 Kingcobra highlights a deeper truth about military aviation. An aircraft's success depends entirely on the doctrine it's built for. American engineers and test pilots had judged the Kingcobra through the narrow lens of high-altitude strategic bombing support, never realizing that, in the brutal low-level battles of the Eastern Front, their reject would become one of the most effective fighters of the entire war. Bombing doctrine, high-altitude, long-range escort missions deep over enemy territory. By those standards, the P-51 Mustang was the superior aircraft, and the P-63's rejection seemed justified. But the Soviets were fighting a completely different kind of war. Short-range, low-altitude missions supporting ground troops, flying multiple sorties each day from rough forward airstrips in freezing conditions. For that environment, the Kingcobra was nearly perfect. The fighter that struggled at 25,000 feet completely dominated at 10,000. Its heavy armor, seen by American pilots as a burden, saved Soviet lives during close air support. The 37-500 her cannon that seemed awkward at high altitude became lethal at treetop level. At first, Bell engineers ignored the concerns raised by Soviet test pilots about the P-63's spin tendencies. But those same suggestions, moving the center of gravity forward, strengthening the armor, and adding extra hardpoints, ended up transforming the aircraft into a weapon perfectly suited for the Eastern Front. American women ferry pilots flew thousands of Kingcobras from Buffalo to Alaska, unaware of the impact these rejected planes would soon have in Soviet hands. From there, Soviet women pilots took over, flying the aircraft across Siberia to frontline squadrons, a forgotten story of courage and cooperation that remained classified for decades. The P-63 Kingcobra never reached the fame of the Mustang or Spitfire. It wasn't as iconic as the Corsair or Thunderbolt, yet its legacy is far more profound. Of the 303 Kingcobras built, 2,397, over 72%, went to the Soviet Union, one of the highest export ratios of any American aircraft in World War II. For every Kingcobra that wore American insignia, 3 bore the Red Star of the USSR. Its combat success under Soviet doctrine validated design decisions the U.S. had dismissed. The mid-engine layout that seemed strange to American pilots proved advantageous in combat, offering balanced weight distribution, stability in dives, and a powerful cannon perfectly aligned with the nose. The P-63's post-war role in Soviet jet training extended its influence even further. Thousands of future MiG pilots trained on Kingcobras, learning tricycle gear landings and energy management before transitioning to early jets, like the MiG-15 and MiG-17. This meant that during the Korean War, some Soviet and Chinese pilots facing American forces had actually learned to fly on the very same aircraft the U.S. had once labeled unfit. The irony was unmistakable. America's rejected fighter had trained its Cold War adversaries. The story of the P-63 proves a timeless truth. Rejected doesn't mean worthless. Context matters. Mission profiles matter. The same airplane that failed to escort bombers over Berlin became unmatched at low-level ground attack over Ukraine. America saw a flawed design. The Soviets saw an opportunity. And that difference in doctrine reshaped military. Aviation, the Kingcobra, didn't change the outcome of the war by dominating skies over Europe. It changed history by showing that every weapon's value depends on where and how it's used. The Allies America armed ended up discovering what its own engineers had overlooked. By the time the last Soviet P-63s were retired in the early 1950s, they had flown longer, fought harder, and trained more pilots than Bell aircraft ever imagined when those first red-starred fighters left the Niagara Falls assembly line. To America, the P-63 was a failure. To the Soviet Union, it was exactly what victory required. And that difference in perspective changed everything.